Remember when the world shut down during COVID? If you had a job that could be done remotely, you had to figure out how to do that. Zoom became part of the whole work routine, but it wasn't always easy. You may remember the lawyer who got stuck with a kitten face filter on during a Zoom court hearing.
Can you hear me, Judge?
I can hear you. I think it's a filter.
It is, and I don't know how to remove it. I've got my assistant here. She's trying to, but I'm prepared to go forward with it. I'm here live. I'm not a cat.
There's something about that kind of sums up the chaos that we were living through at that time in 2020, I think. But more and more businesses are now calling their staff back into the office to work in person. And for more, we're joined by Abby Hall, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Tampa. Abby, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
A lot of jobs, can be done remotely. We've kind of seen that play out over the last 5 years. What is the argument for getting back to in-person work?
So I think there are a few different arguments that certainly businesses are making for getting back into the office. So you see lots of arguments about things like company culture and cohesion. And certainly there is something to be said for that about just things getting done when you're in the office. You happen to run into a colleague or just brainstorming sessions that can sometimes happen. But there are costs associated with that too. And primarily one of those costs, as you mentioned, is flexibility. And one of the areas where we're really seeing the impacts of that are on working families, particularly young working women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's get into that in a little bit. But before we do, does getting back to the office mean kind of back to business as usual, or has the remote work boom kind of changed just how we work anyway?
So I think that we're still working out exactly what this landscape of the labor force is going to look like post-pandemic. Because I know for a lot of us, it seemed like this shift to remote work was going to usher in this just new age of everyone working remotely because people thought no one is going to want to go back to the office after this. But we're not only seeing companies starting to push back against that, but we're also seeing that there are people who themselves as workers place a significant value on being in the office for various reasons.
Mm-hmm. We're at 813-755-6562. If you've got thoughts about remote work, maybe you've had to come back into the office, maybe you're still on the remote schedule, let us know how you feel about it. You can also send us an email. We're at FloridaMatters@WUSF.org. You talked about childcare, right? So let's kind of unpack that a little bit. It's expensive anyway, even before the pandemic. It can be pretty hard to find. What did a switch to remote work in 2020 do to that whole kind of economy of childcare?
So for childcare in the pandemic, I know as someone who had a very young child in 2020, a lot of daycare shut down. And so for a lot of us, we became childcare and worked out of necessity. But certainly the pandemic, we saw the shuttering of a lot of different daycares. So now if you're looking throughout the state of Florida more generally, infant care year-round is about $12,000 on average. And then for toddler care, so think about 4 years old, somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000 a year, depending on location and type of facility.
Do you think there's enough talk about that? Does that sort of factor into when people sort of talk about the cost of raising a family?
I think it absolutely does. One of the things that I know again, this is anecdotal data, but there's certainly more robust data sets to back this up. When it comes to thinking about how much it costs to raise children, certainly costs like childcare and what it costs to educate your children factor very, very prominently into not only the number of children that people decide to have, but also things like where it is that people are going to live.
Mm-hmm. So, it sounds like in some ways there's kind of two things happening here. One, the pandemic and the immediate impacts in 2020 sort of disrupted the childcare business. And then when people are going back to work, what does that now mean? You're looking for childcare. What's out there for you?
So one of the things I know in the Tampa Bay region is that the kind of joke, which isn't really funny, is that if you want to have childcare when your child is born, you should get on the waiting list for a daycare before you're pregnant, because that's the only way that you're probably going to have a spot, especially if you are looking for infant care. Mm-hmm. But what we're really starting to see here, and this is certainly a continuation of existing trends, is that women, particularly moms, are having to make a very difficult choice about what type of work they're going to engage in, if they're going to work full-time or part-time. And then this has real implications for labor market outcomes, not just for working moms, but also for their families.
Mm-hmm. Can you kind of explain what that means in economics professor terms, like
Yes.
labor market outcomes. What are we talking about
So
here?
when
Kinds
we-
of jobs people are doing.
Sure. So when we talk about labor market outcomes, we mean things not just like wages and salaries, but we talk about things like retirement. If you're out of the labor force for, say, 5 years because you have 2 children, that has implications for your skill set. You know, maybe your skills get particularly rusty. It might be more difficult for you to re-enter the labor force after being out for a while. And then you start to think about, what does this mean for household income? So say you have a 2-income household, one of the partners steps back from the labor force to provide childcare. What does that mean for a household's finances? And so you start to see how these kind of policy issues, in this case childcare, really do have a household micro implication for everyday people. And young families certainly feel this.
Yeah. I wanted to pull out for a moment, though, and think about a city like Tampa, which has a business district. What does kind of a return to work or going remote and then coming back, what does that kind of mean for, I guess, the physical geography of a city like Tampa, which has a downtown business district?
Sure. So I think that for those of us who work, especially in the downtown area, so I know at the University of Tampa, we are right there smack in the middle of downtown.
Yeah.
So we certainly feel the traffic and the return to the office, that we could say. And it's like any other policy. There are benefits and costs to these returns. So we do see, again, some potential benefits in terms of, the restaurants that are downtown probably really appreciate that additional foot traffic from people returning to the office. People who are maybe liking working from home 5 days a week maybe don't appreciate the fact that they have to come into the office as often. And so there are certainly trade-offs here in both directions. I don't know that it's it depends upon your perspective, I guess, is what we could say in terms of, is this a net benefit or a net cost?
We're talking about the return to in-person work on Florida Matters Live and Local. If you have some thoughts about it, give us a call. We're at 813-755-6562. That's 813-755-6562. You can also send us an email, FloridaMatters@WUSF.org. So, I mean, are there some industries you see in Tampa Bay that may be more impacted by changes in how employees work, whether it's going remote or ditching remote and coming back to in-person work?
So I think that's going to be really industry specific. And I know that certainly a lot of places are maintaining some kind of hybrid work schedule. Now, what exactly that looks like is going to be contingent upon the position and on the company. Now, if we're looking specifically at this issue of working moms and this, do we stay remote or do we return? We see that a lot of women are working in what we call, quote unquote, helping professions. So these would be things like education, nursing, other types of healthcare professions. And those actually have not seen transitions to remote work in the same way that, say, some other fields have. And so in some ways there might be some substantial differences, and in other ways, in other sectors, it might not be as noticeable.
Yeah, okay. What about some of the legal aspects of it? I mean, if you have a company that's saying we need to have people sort of come back and work in person, what are your rights as an employee? Could you, for example, be fired if you say, no, I need to keep working remotely?
So I should preface this by saying that I am not a labor attorney, so
Sure.
anything that I say should be taken with a grain of salt. My impression is that in the state of Florida is that we're an at-will state, and so that means that both employees, but especially employers, have a lot of flexibility. So if you're not able to satisfy the functions of your job, and if your job specifies that you need to be in the office, my understanding is that your employer has quite a bit of latitude.
I wonder too about gig work, because we are seeing a rise in a lot of kind of gig related jobs, whether it's driving for Uber or delivering food or doing things on TaskRabbit, right? Like sort of little micro tasks for folks. Is that something we saw sort of take off during the pandemic, and was it because people had more flexibility, like their main job, they may be able to work remotely, therefore they've got a little bit of time to manage other things on the side? Do you see that sort of changing at all if people are kind of returning to the office en masse?
So there are a couple of things that are really driving this gig economy. So on the one hand, you do have a lot of flexibility that comes with driving for somebody like Uber and Lyft. And so for individuals, say, like working moms, or for other people who maybe have other constraints upon their schedule, those types of employment opportunities are particularly appealing. The other reason that we see people picking up these kinds of side hustles or these other jobs is because they're trying to supplement their income. And so depending upon the person, seeing that kind of uptick in remote work, it may tell us a couple of different things. So we have to look at the data a bit more carefully.
I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, but is there a bit of a middle ground emerging between, what companies want and the reality of trying to find the employees you want? And if they want a little more flexibility, that may involve, if not working full-time at the office, maybe spending a bit of time remote and a bit of time in an office situation.
I think ultimately this is going to come down to exactly what we would anticipate, is that this is going to be a variety of different, not to, again, be a cliche economist, but supply and demand factors. What is it that workers want? What is it that employers want? And then how is it that people negotiate? And so one of the things that I know I talk to my students about is that if you are really interested in having a job where you have some flexibility, that's something that you need to push for. Now the critical question is, do you have the leverage to be able to push for things like that? And so that's where then you start to getting into, I think, some interesting questions. Some of them are very personal, but then others are a bit more broader.
Well, Abby Hall, thank you so much for your insights. Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Tampa. Appreciate you coming in.
My pleasure.